Hey gardeners, Lindsay here with the Mindful Living Movement. Today we're going to talk about weeding. Now, specifically weeding during the growing season, and even more specifically in this early part of sort of the spring still. We haven't quite fully got into summer yet, where all of the seeds that we've direct sown are probably starting to sprout. We've got lots of transplants that are starting to grow, but they're still not, as big as they're going to get even in just a few weeks' time. Now, weeding for the most of us, I think, is not maybe our favorite part of gardening. And so that can mean that it kind of gets away on us, where we sort of just put it off and put it off and put it off. And then pretty soon it starts to overwhelm. And then you end up looking at the garden going, holy crap, how am I going to get this under control? So first things first, why is it so important to weed more than ever right now? Well, because when your plants are really, really small, the weeds, they can win very easily, especially when you get into like root vegetables, things like carrots and beets. They're really susceptible to stress from competition because the weeds will start to take over and the weeds get bigger than they do, and so they can lose. The weeds will get bigger and they'll start to shade out your plants, your seedlings, and that's not good because that's going to slow down your process. So right now we really, really need to be on top of our weeding while the plants are still really small. Once the plants start to get bigger and they start to produce more leaf growth and those leaves start to shade the soil and you don't have as much open bare soil, the weeds aren't going to have as easy of a time to grow. So as we get later in the season, it gets a little bit easier to maintain the weeds because our vegetables and the flowers and the things that we've put in the garden, they're taking up all the space. And so those extra few weeds, they don't quite have the same advantage. But right now, we really, really need to be on top of it. I'm going to share with you a few tools that I use here that make life so much easier, so much quicker, and kind of keep you from having to, be down on your hands and your knees hand weeding, because even though hand weeding is fabulous and it works great, and it's probably, the most, accurate you're ever going to weed your garden, you don't have to do that. Maybe a little bit, but really for the most part, you really don't have to do that. So I'm going to show you my absolute essential tools. There's a million tools out there for weeding, but these are the ones that I absolutely love. And I have a whole shed full of tools that are supposed to weed my garden, but these are literally the only ones that follow me around as I'm maintaining my bed. So I'll show you the reason why, and I'll also show you them in action and why they're so great and why I love them. And then we'll talk about sort of some suppression techniques to, help you with maybe keeping grass from coming into your beds, or maybe you're trying to deal with a very large area in your garden. Maybe it's less of a raised bed, sort of urban garden, and maybe you've got a very large plot with some big rows and stuff like that happening. So let's start with the hand tools here. All right, so the very first tool that I really love is one of these big, it's like a push-pull type hoe. It's a very broad category. There's lots that sort of fall under that. This one is sometimes called a loop or a hula hoe because this sort of thing wiggles back and forth if you're trying to search it online. And I'm definitely going to link to being able to purchase like these exact ones so that you can kind of just get straight to it. Now, the reason that this is so great is, one, it comes with a really, really long handle, and this is pretty big. I can cover a pretty solid area. I use this one in particular for sort of my perennial areas of the garden where I have lots of tree mulch, and sort of like this tree mulch that's sitting beside me here. It's really heavy duty and sturdy, and it has enough power to push back and forth through the mulch without sort of like bending or doing anything weird like that. This works really great too in your larger areas. So in the early part of the season before my plants have filled in, I can use this somewhat in sort of a bed like this, but later on this is going to get to be just a little bit too big. But if you have, in between big rows, whether it's 12 inches, even bigger than that, and you need to cover a big area, this works amazing, and it actually goes very, very quickly. And this is what I start with. So my triage method of weeds is always start with the biggest areas first, like go up and down the main rows or big wide open areas, that kind of thing. Especially if the weeds are really, really bad, this can kind of give shape back to your garden. You can start to see, okay, these are where my rows are at. And it can give you a little bit of confidence too, which is really important, because that overwhelm of like, holy crap, how am I gonna get these under control can very easily cause us to just not want to do it at all. So this is my first go-to. Now, the alternate to this, if you are gardening in a very large open plot, like maybe out in the country somewhere where you've got loads of space and you've got solid spaces in between your beds that you can, walk down very easily, if those start to get really overrun with weeds, you certainly can work with one of these, but depending on the severity of it, you may actually want to just get out your rototiller. I am transitioning away from like stirring up the soil wherever possible, but if you need to get those weeds under control, nothing beats pushing that rototiller up and down the rows, and then as the years go by, as you get better and better at keeping your weeds under control, they're not going to be able to reroot, they're not going to be able to drop their seeds, so you're going to have less of them coming back, and likely you're not going to have to worry about that. But if you're just, maybe trying to recover a garden bed that hasn't been planted in a really long time and you've just planted it this year and the weeds are just too much, maybe that's an option that you start with. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It takes a few years to really win the battle of weeds, particularly like chickweed is one that really overran my garden for a long time, and I'm finally at the point where it's not a serious issue. They're definitely still there, but you just really have to keep on top of it, getting those weeds out of there. So biggest areas, get yourself a tool like this, big long handle one. It's amazing how much area you can cover. It works fabulously. Now the second tool that I have here is also a push-pull type hoe. However, they're a little bit harder to find, and so what I have here is actually just a coat hanger that has been bent. This thing is my absolute favorite for like these kinds of beds here that are really close planted, raised beds, there's not big rows and things like that. This allows me, I've got essentially 3 different sort of sides to it. So I've got this longer wide side here, which I can still go up and down rows with. But then I've also got sort of this little like 2-inch side here so that I can cover a little bit of a smaller area with this. And then I've also got this little corner end here. And the corners are really good because you can get right into sort of the narrows and scoop around your plants. And this is like the fine weeding. Oh my gosh, it works so fantastic. So this thing I use a lot. Now, I did discover recently that there's a company that you can actually buy 3 different ends like this that are not coat hangers. The issue that I have with this one is it kind of bends a little bit here if I'm trying to work in like mulch and stuff like that. If I'm in just regular topsoil, dirt, garden bed type situation, it stays perfectly fine, but it doesn't do like the mulch. It bends. It's too flimsy. Unlike this dude is definitely not bending. And then this is just a broom handle that I found at a local hardware store. And that is really like the simplest thing ever, and it is the absolute best tool. If you can find them locally, they're getting more popular. This wire weeder is kind of what they would call it. It's a push-pull. They're getting a little bit more common, but I find sometimes you just have to order them online. Or if you're sort of like me and you're like, I can figure out how to do that. Coat hanger, broom handle, fantastic, works great. Now the other thing that you can do with this, and I'm probably going to do it very soon, is I'm going to take this exact same thing and I'm going to attach it probably onto either like a shorter broom handle, so I've got just like a handheld tool, or like a paint roller handle kind of thing. If you've got, extras of those around, I always seem to have lots of those. Anything that's got a little bit of a shorter handle, that if you're like, for me, if I were just sitting here and I just wanted to like hand weed or something like that, then I've got both the tools. I've got the long handle for reaching way into the back of the bed without actually having to climb in the back of the bed. And then I've got the little hand one for, doing some of the other work. The other thing that you can often find for the really fine weeding work is this. This is a barbecue fork. This is not a gardening tool. However, the really fine tines on this thing make it really easy to just like get underneath the roots of things. And because it's so, skinny, I can get really close up to plants and do like some really delicate weeding work. So this thing I actually use quite a bit as well. So if you've got one of these around already, fabulous, you can use that. And then this is a tool I inherited from my grandma, but this thing right here, this is also that push-pull. So you just kind of push it back and forth and it cuts and gets underneath the weeds and removes them and gets them, unrooted, which is the main thing. especially if they're really, really deeply rooted, and you can use like these kinds of tools to just easily, and then you just scoop them up and throw them in a bucket and eventually, you know, discard them into either your municipal compost system or into just the garbage if you have to. Try not to put weeds into your own personal household compost. Most household composts don't reach the appropriate temperature to actually sterilize the weeds and the weed seeds. So if you're throwing the weeds into your compost and then your compost is eventually coming back into your garden, you're just, you know, completing the cycle. So we want to just get those weeds out. Municipal composts are huge, big systems. They have the mass to be able to generate the heat to sterilize in most cases. So that's where all my weeds go. We're lucky enough to have a bin here that is compost that goes to that. So that is where all of the weeds that I pull out of my garden. And before I show you guys these in action, the one other really important thing is, as you push these tools around and you loosen up the weeds and stuff like that, do your best to actually scoop up and remove the weeds. Like, don't just leave them laying on the dirt if you can help it. Not all weeds will re-root themselves. Like elm seeds, for example. Elm seeds right now, which you're going to see a lot of, is probably one of my biggest issues in the springtime. They are just, shed their seeds all over my garden, and every single one of those little seeds likes to sprout, but they do not re-root. So thankfully for that, all I have to do is just make sure that I get the root up out of the soil, and that's it. However, chickweed, the other one that is my arch nemesis, it re-roots. And it seeds like crazy, and the seeds will stay in the soil for up to 7 years. So just scoop them all up, discard them, try not to leave them laying in your soil. Obviously there's going to be some that still stay, not the end of the world, but do your best to try and get them out of there. So it is time. I will show you what these guys look like and kind of where I use them in my garden and why they're so fantastic. once you've done all your hard work of weeding your garden beds and your soil and everything, if you leave bare open soil, like really large open areas sort of like this without plants, Mother Nature is just going to continue to put seeds and try and grow new plants there. That's just kind of how it works. Bare open soil is not going to stay that way for long. So what you can do is you can either, strategically place plants to fill in areas. The more leaf growth, the more the soil is going to get shaded, the less weeds are going to grow. Or you can lay down mulch like this. So this giant area here, my whole front yard used to be grass, and we've laid down a bunch of rocks and a ton of tree mulch, and underneath this tree mulch is either one of two things. We actually didn't lay down any landscape fabric. We laid down a really solid thick layer of either newspaper, like 4 or 5 sheets, or just straight up big sheets of cardboard. And on top, right on top of the grass, right on top of the weeds, everything that was already there. It's amazing because it kills the weeds and the grass and everything without you having to dig it up or anything like that. And then you put all the mulch on top of it. The mulch, the cardboard, newspaper, whatever, all the grass, the weeds, everything that were underneath all of this, they're all just going to compost together and build really fabulous soil for you, but give you like a bit of a placeholder, which is sort of what's happening in the front here. Little by little, I'm adding more perennials. Things are starting to take up more space. I'm strategically planting things like squash and different stuff around, herbs and things like that, so that they can sort of shade the soil. And even though there's open mulch and stuff like that here, weeds are gonna start to sprout, from seeds and stuff dropping on top of them. But mulch allows you to get the weeds and like get the roots out way easier than actual soil compacted, as you probably saw with my big hoe going through the tree mulch. Everything was just barely rooted. All I had to do was move the tree mulch around and everything came right out. So it's so great for filling in space. If you've just got like open crappy grass and a whole bunch of weeds in open area, or in between your raised garden beds is a really great thing to do. Lay down a bunch of cardboard, put a solid, try and start with at least 4 inches, 4 even 6 inches of tree mulch, because it will compact fairly quickly actually. This was a solid 6 inches when we started, and it's dropped down to maybe in like the 3 or 4 range now. And we just did a little top up of 1 inch this year just to kind of fill back to the border. But the more thickly you lay it down, just the quicker and easier it's going to kill grass and whatever other gross things are kind of growing underneath without you having to dig anything else up. So I highly recommend that. You can also just go straight to landscape fabric and lay landscape fabric down in between your rows as well. If you don't want to deal with finding cardboard, or you don't want to, work with tree mulch and stuff like that, you can totally just lay down landscape fabric as well, just to keep the weeds from growing. However, landscape fabric doesn't seem to smother grass very well all by itself, and I really love this because it does that, but then also it's building organic soil for me. And there's different areas of my yard here that I have now, maybe about 4 or 5 years, I've been, going with the mulch method, and it's really amazing to see the soil that's starting to happen underneath there, because all I had was really crappy grass sitting on top of sand. There was next to no soil, nothing that would hold moisture, nothing that really grew plants really well. And now I'm actually able to grow, a lot of plants. There's moisture retention, there's soil starting to build. So this is my preferred method, and I do highly, highly recommend it. So this is all the things that I use for weed suppression in and around my yard, mulch, and just a few strategic tools. But definitely in the springtime, just do everything that you can to get the weeds under control right now, early in the spring, so that when your plants fill in, that'll help out the process, but that they don't get drowned out by the weeds, because that's a very real thing that can happen. I wish you the best of luck, and if you have other favorite tools or something you would like to share, please drop them in the comments. Hit like, hit subscribe so that other viewers can also find this video and get help that they need with getting their weeds under control. Have a beautiful rest of the day, gardeners, and we will see you soon.